The death of the petrodollar didn't arrive with explosions, headlines, or a presidential address. It arrived the way all dying empires collapse. First as whispers, then as silence, and finally as a sound so loud the world pretends it can't hear it. Because this is how the end truly begins, not with a crisis, but with a moment when the old system stops working and nobody can force it back to life. For 50 years, the world was locked inside a contract it never signed. Oil meant dollars, and dollars meant power. It was the invisible chain that turned the global economy into a single machine, and the United States held the only key. As long as every nation needed dollars to buy energy, America could print influence at will. Inflation was exported outward. Stability was imported inward. And anyone who tried to challenge the system found aircraft carriers waiting over the horizon. But tonight, that bargain lies in ruins. The first crack appeared far from Washington, a quiet deal in a fluorescent-lit room in Riyadh, where a minister signed a contract written in Mandarin instead of English. No cameras, no press, just a signature. Yet that single pen stroke shattered a half-century of monetary architecture. Oil would now be sold for yuan. For the first time since 1974, the world's most essential commodity no longer required the world's most powerful currency. The petrodollar didn't just falter, it bled. And as the ink dried, markets reacted like an organism sensing a wound. Bond yields flickered, currency desks trembled, gold surged in a single violent heartbeat. Traders recognized what governments refused to admit. The foundation of the dollar's supremacy had cracked, and the fracture could not be contained. Because you cannot lose oil and keep power. You cannot lose trust and keep value. You cannot lose control and still call yourself the center of the financial universe. The next blow came from the East. BRICS, once dismissed as a loose club of developing nations, suddenly moved with the precision of a single organism. Central banks bulked up their gold reserves. Cross-border payment systems bypassed SWIFT entirely. Bilateral trade in local currencies grew like a storm cloud forming in slow motion, darkening the entire horizon. Then came the headlines that should have frozen the world. Saudi Arabia will not renew the petrodollar agreement. 8 words that carried the weight of an empire's obituary. Oil shipments priced in multiple currencies. Energy futures written outside the dollar system. Derivative markets scrambling to reprice risk that had been taken for granted for generations. It was the kind of moment historians spend decades trying to frame. But the reality was simpler and far more brutal. If the world doesn't need dollars to buy energy, the world doesn't need dollars at all. And suddenly, the United States found itself confronting a question it had avoided for 50 years. What is the dollar worth when it can no longer command obedience? The collapse didn't look like 1929. It didn't look like 2008. There were no panicked crowds outside banks, no CEOs collapsing in tears. It was quieter, colder, more like a body realizing its heart is beating just a little too slowly. A fractional slip, a metabolic failure. Bond markets that once absorbed infinite debt began to choke. Nations that once begged for dollar liquidity now sought escape routes. Allies drifted, rivals accelerated. Every empire dies alone, but it rarely understands the loneliness until the end arrives. And for the first time in modern history, the world began to imagine a tomorrow where the dollar was not the axis of gravity, but just another currency orbiting a new global center. Investors felt it first, the unease, the tremor under the floor. Ordinary people felt it next, the price increases that stopped being temporary, the savings that evaporated in real time, the sense that something fundamental had shifted and no one was willing to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud makes it real. Yet the truth is unavoidable. The petrodollar is not dying. It is already dead. What remains is the echo, the final vibration of a system that once dominated the world, but can no longer command its loyalty. And the most haunting part? The collapse didn't begin this year or last decade. It began the moment the dollar stopped being money and became a weapon. Tonight, the weapon slips from America's hand. Tonight, the world's monetary axis rotates. Tonight, the empire breathes a little slower. This is the moment history will return to, the night the petrodollar died. Every collapse feels unprecedented to the people living through it. They believe their era is unique, their crisis exceptional, their downfall impossible. But history has no patience for this kind of innocence. It repeats itself with mechanical precision, and every empire that thought it was immortal has eventually learned the same fatal lesson. Power is rented, not owned, and the rent always comes due. The fall of the petrodollar is not a modern anomaly. It is simply the newest chapter in a story as old as civilization itself. A story written in silver coins, gold talents, paper notes, and digital ledgers. A story of nations rising through discipline and collapsing through excess. The Romans believed their currency was eternal. For centuries, the denarius held the confidence of the known world, a coin so trusted that soldiers, merchants, and kings used it without hesitation. But when ambition outgrew resources, the empire debased its money to fund wars it could no longer afford. Silver became bronze with a thin metallic disguise. Inflation infected the empire, trade routes decayed, and the world learned a rule that would outlive Rome itself. When the currency rots, the empire rots with it. Centuries later, the British Empire followed the same choreography. The pound sterling once ruled oceans and continents. London dictated prices from Bombay to Cairo, from Hong Kong to Cape Town. Yet power demanded expansion, expansion demanded war, and war demanded debt. After two global conflicts, Britain's monetary dominance evaporated. The pound lost its crown. The empire lost its pulse. Different time, same pattern. Then came 1944, Bretton Woods. The United States emerged from the ashes of World War II with unmatched power. Its factories untouched, its military ascendant, its gold reserves overflowing. The dollar became king, not because the world trusted America more than others, but because America was the last nation standing. But even this system carried the same flaw that had doomed the empires before it. Growth requires spending, spending requires borrowing, and borrowing weakens the pillar holding everything up. By the late 1960s, America faced a dilemma Rome and Britain would have recognized instantly. The cost of maintaining global dominance exceeded the value its currency could sustain. Foreign nations, sensing weakness, demanded gold in exchange for dollars. Gold outflows surged, confidence cracked. And so, in 1971, the U.S. made a decision that changed the world. Nixon severed the dollar from gold entirely, a clean break, a surgical amputation, and overnight, money became an idea instead of a promise. But something had to replace gold. Something had to anchor the dollar. That something was oil. The United States persuaded Saudi Arabia to price global energy in dollars, creating a synthetic pillar to replace the real one. The petrodollar was born, a system that mimicked the stability of Bretton Woods, but carried a hidden flaw. It required permanent obedience from the world's largest energy producers. And obedience is a currency that always devalues. Every empire has tried to outrun this pattern. All believed they were different. All insisted they were special. Yet each followed the same five-stage cycle. Foundation, a strong, trusted currency backed by real value. Expansion, growing influence, growing military, growing ambition. Extraction, exploiting the currency's status to fund global control. Distortion, debasement, overreach, financial engineering, political manipulation. Collapse, the world seeks alternatives and finds them. Rome tried to fight the cycle. Britain tried. France tried. The Ottomans tried. Every major empire tried, and every one of them failed. Not because their leaders were foolish, but because the pattern is structural, not personal. When money becomes power, power becomes addiction, and addiction always ends the same way. Today, the petrodollar has reached stage 5. The world is no longer willing to play by rules written in Washington. Nations that once bowed now hedge. Former allies diversify. Rivals collaborate. Energy producers explore new alliances beyond the dollar's reach. The same gravitational shift that once toppled Rome and dethroned Britain now pulls at the United States. And yet, Americans are told everything is fine, stable, secure. But history laughs at reassurance, because the pattern is older than any president, any central bank, any treaty. It doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't negotiate with empires. It simply waits, and when the conditions align, it strikes with perfect accuracy. The fall of the petrodollar is not chaos. It is choreography, predictable, measured, inevitable. And anyone who understands the pattern knows what comes next will not be correction. It will be consequence. History does not repeat, it reenacts. The costumes change, the language evolves, the technology advances, but the power dynamics, the fears, the fractures, those remain identical. And today's world is walking step by step through the same corridors that past empires once stumbled down moments before the fall. Look closely, and the echoes become impossible to ignore. In Rome's final century, inflation became a quiet plague. Prices drifted upward in ways the public tried to rationalize, then normalized, then feared. Today, the same phenomenon stalks the modern world. Wages static, savings decaying, cost of living rising like a slow tide swallowing a shoreline. Politicians blame supply chains, pandemics, corporations, foreign adversaries, anything but the truth. Rome did the same until there was nothing left to blame. Then there is the debt, the oldest warning sign in the imperial autopsy manual. Britain drowned itself financing wars it could not afford. France bankrupted itself maintaining a lifestyle it no longer earned. Today, the United States carries a debt so large it cannot be paid, refinanced, or even conceptualized. It expands not linearly, but exponentially, feeding on itself like a self-replicating organism. Every empire convinces itself the numbers do not matter. Every empire learns they always do. External conflicts, proxy wars, strategic entanglements, political brinkmanship formed the next parallel. When Rome was weak, its rivals tested it with skirmishes at the borders. When Britain faltered, competitors probed with regional destabilization. Today, the US finds itself entangled in multiple global flashpoints, each draining resources, attention, and legitimacy. The world no longer waits for Washington's approval. It moves without it. But the most striking parallel is not military or economic. It is coalition building, the moment when dissatisfied nations stop complaining individually and begin aligning collectively. For Rome, it was the Germanic tribes. For Britain, it was rival European alliances. For America, it is BRICS. What began as a loose acronym invented by a Goldman Sachs economist has evolved into a power block with its own institutions, currency ambitions, and strategic vision. These nations aren't simply trading partners, they are economies tired of being satellites in a dollar-centric universe. And they are acting with a unity that once seemed impossible. Their gold reserves rise, their bilateral agreements multiply, their diplomatic alliances deepen. Then came the moment that turned historical parallel into historical repetition. Saudi Arabia began openly pricing oil in non-dollar currencies. This was the Forbidden Act, the single behavior that kept past empires awake at night. Because when an empire's currency loses its monopoly on commodities, its decline accelerates beyond political control. China and Saudi Arabia signing an energy deal in yuan is not innovation. It is recapitulation, the same strategic realignment that toppled the pound when oil producers shifted toward the dollar after World War II. Now the shift is reversing. The pendulum is returning to its original position. And just as Rome's currency died when provinces stopped accepting it, and Britain's currency died when global shipping abandoned it, the dollar faces the same fracture. The world is diversifying, hedging, insulating itself from the monetary gravity of Washington. Individually, each action looks small, a trade agreement here, a reserve adjustment there. But this is the deception of collapse. It never feels catastrophic in real time. It feels like a sequence of adjustments, each one rational, each one defensible, each one seemingly harmless. Only in hindsight do you see the cliff's edge. Energy contracts in yuan, gold accumulation on a scale unseen since the Cold War, cross-border payment systems bypassing SWIFT, central banks unloading U.S. treasuries, nations testing new settlement currencies, debt spiraling beyond the point of stabilization. These are not isolated events. They are the synchronized beats of the same drum that marked the retreats of past empires. The world is not breaking the petrodollar system. It is simply outgrowing it, the way every era eventually outgrows the financial architecture of the empire that came before. And this is the point where the parallel becomes prophecy. When the old system ceases to serve the world builds a new one. Not through revolution, but through quiet coordination, until the tipping point arrives and the old structure collapses under its own weight. We are not approaching that tipping point. We are standing on it, and the ground beneath us is starting to shift. For decades, the world was told that the dollar's supremacy was a natural law, unquestionable, immutable, ordained by economic brilliance and political stability. But no empire ever collapses from natural causes. Something, or someone, always loosens the bolts first. The truth is simple, brutal, and unforgiving. The petrodollar didn't die. It was murdered. Not by enemies abroad, but by the architects within. The central bankers, policymakers, and corporate power brokers who believed they could reshape reality with spreadsheets and speeches. They treated the global monetary system as a puppet stage, tugging strings no one else was allowed to touch. And in their arrogance, they broke the mechanism that held the world together. Behind closed doors, the Federal Reserve became the most powerful institution on Earth, a private boardroom able to create money at will, shielded by complexity, protected by opacity. Every crisis became an opportunity. Every opportunity became expansion. Money stopped being a tool of exchange and became a tool of control. But a currency cannot serve two masters. It cannot be both a global reserve asset and a domestic political instrument. The moment the dollar was weaponized through sanctions, asset freezes, and financial coercion, it violated the single rule that kept the system intact: neutrality. When the dollar became an arm of U.S. foreign policy, every nation understood the message: you don't hold dollars, dollars hold you. And that was the day the world began planning its escape. Yet Washington acted surprised, shocked, outraged, as if decades of monetary manipulation, covert interventions, and geopolitical engineering had no consequences. As if the global financial system were a chessboard rigged to only produce victories. But ask a simple question: why did Saudi Arabia begin drifting away from the United States? Why did China accumulate record levels of gold? Why did Russia build alternative payment systems long before sanctions hit? Why did BRICS expand at the exact moment Western debt spiraled out of control? Because they saw the truth long before the public did. The petrodollar was being hollowed out from the inside. While citizens argued about elections and headlines, the real decisions were made in rooms without windows, where officials treated global trust as an inexhaustible commodity. They flooded the world with trillions of new dollars, assuming demand would absorb the excess forever. They leveraged the currency's reserve status to fund wars and programs with money that didn't exist. They disconnected cost from consequence, value from discipline, stability from responsibility. The result was inevitable. The U.S. banking sector consolidated into a handful of too-big-to-fail institutions, each intertwined with the Treasury and Federal Reserve in a web of mutual survival. Politicians spent without restraint, knowing the bill would be paid not by taxpayers, but by invisible dilution, a slow theft from every saver on Earth. And while the public struggled, the elite flourished. While currencies wobbled, their portfolios soared. While the system cracked, they called it strength. But the world watched, and the world remembered. Every sanction created a new incentive for nations to de-dollarize. Every bailout confirmed the system was rigged. Every debt ceiling negotiation exposed the illusion of fiscal control. Every emergency money printing spree revealed the truth. The petrodollar was no longer backed by oil. It was backed by confidence. And confidence is the fastest resource to burn. This is why the shift happened suddenly, not because global powers wanted to overthrow the dollar, but because they no longer trusted the hands controlling it. The revelation is not that America's rivals plotted against the system. The revelation is that the system's guardians abandoned it first. They turned money into leverage. They turned power into addiction. They turned a global reserve currency into a political weapon. And the world responded exactly as history predicted. It began building a new order outside their reach. What the public perceives as geopolitical realignment is, at its core, an act of self-defense. Nations protecting themselves from a monetary structure that no longer protected them. The petrodollar didn't collapse because the world changed. It collapsed because the world stopped believing in the illusion manufactured by the elite who controlled it. And now, standing in the ruins, a single truth cuts through the noise. You cannot betray the world and expect it to keep your currency alive. The architects of empire wrote their own downfall. The only question left is whether the rest of us can survive the fallout. The end of a monetary era feels like standing in the aftermath of an explosion. The smoke hasn't cleared, but you already understand that nothing will return to the way it was. The dollar's age of unquestioned dominance is over. The petrodollar system, once the backbone of global energy markets, lies in silence. And now the world faces the same question every civilization confronts after its financial empire collapses. What fills the vacuum? Contrary to the fears whispered in newsrooms and trading floors, collapse is not just an ending. It is a reset, a moment when the old architecture crumbles and new foundations emerge from below the dust. History shows that monetary transitions don't simply destroy. They rearrange, they realign, they redefine. And this time is no different. As the petrodollar's influence dissolves, a new monetary constellation begins to take shape, not centered around a single empire, but distributed across multiple poles of power. Gold reclaims its ancient role as the anchor of trust. Energy-rich nations construct new trade routes invisible to Washington. Digital settlement systems rise where SWIFT once ruled unchallenged. The world is not falling into chaos. It is reorganizing itself. This is the dawn after the funeral. The headlines will call it instability. Politicians will call it threat. Analysts will call it uncertainty. But beneath the noise, a deeper pattern emerges, one driven not by panic, but by necessity. For decades, the dollar's supremacy forced nations into a single orbit. Now, freed from that gravity, they drift toward their own monetary centers. Local currencies find new relevance. Regional alliances gain institutional weight. The balance of power shifts not through war, but through settlement ledgers. And here lies the quiet truth. A multipolar monetary world was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. Every generation believes its currency regime is permanent until the day it isn't. The gold standard felt eternal. Bretton Woods felt unbreakable. The petrodollar felt invincible. But permanence has never been part of the human condition, only transition. And as this transition accelerates, individuals face a choice that empires often ignore: adapt or collapse. The people who survive these shifts are not the ones who cling to the old system, but the ones who see the direction of the current and move with it. They understand that when trust disappears from the world's reserve currency, value must seek refuge in something real: commodities, energy, land, metals, infrastructure, production. The world is returning to the oldest form of financial truth: if you can't touch it, you don't truly own it. For the first time in half a century, the global economy is no longer built on the illusion of infinite liquidity. It is being rebuilt on scarcity, on energy, on production, on tangible assets that cannot be printed at will. That shift will be painful. It will be destabilizing, but it will also be cleansing. Because what dies here is not prosperity. What dies is dependence, and what rises is resilience. As nations restructure their currencies, their alliances, and their economic strategies, ordinary people, the silent majority ignored by the architects of empire, will be forced to confront a new reality. The safety they were promised was never real. The system they trusted was never stable. But in that revelation lies empowerment. When illusions collapse, clarity begins. The petrodollar era taught the world to believe wealth was something created by governments. The post-petrodollar world will teach the opposite, that wealth is built, mined, extracted, produced, and preserved. That nations survive not by printing value, but by creating it. And in that transformation, a final truth emerges. The fall of the dollar is not the end of the story. It is the end of the chapter that kept the world asleep. What comes next will be unfamiliar, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. But it will also be honest. It will be grounded in real value, not manufactured power. And those who understand the shift will not be crushed by it. They will rise with it. The empire of paper is fading. The age of reality is returning. And the world, for the first time in decades, is awakening.